At 15:47 hours on December 17, 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced approximately 200 journalists in the White House press room for his 702nd press conference. He was about to announce a policy that would fundamentally alter American neutrality without technically ending it. A policy that would arm Britain and eventually the Soviet Union with tens of billions of dollars in weapons while America remained officially at peace. A policy that would make American entry into World War II inevitable, but would be sold to the American people as the best way to keep America out of the war. Roosevelt began with a homespun analogy. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation. Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire's over. The analogy was deliberate, simple, designed for newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts. It obscured what Roosevelt was actually proposing, giving Britain weapons worth billions of dollars with no expectation of payment, no timeline for return, and no certainty the weapons would ever come back. The garden hose would be used, damaged, destroyed. Britain could not pay for it. Britain had no intention of paying for it. Roosevelt knew this, but the analogy made the policy sound reasonable, neighborly, prudent. What Roosevelt did not say at that press conference was that Britain was bankrupt, completely, verifiably, imminently bankrupt, and that bankruptcy meant Britain would lose the war unless America found a way to continue supplying weapons without requiring payment. The crisis had been building for over a year. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, British gold reserves stood at approximately $864 million, roughly $3.5 billion at 1939 exchange rates. This was Britain's total liquid wealth available for purchasing weapons and supplies. Before the war, Britain had been the world's largest creditor nation. The empire was wealthy, but wealth in assets, colonies, industries, shipping could not be quickly converted to cash for buying American weapons. The United States had passed Neutrality Acts in 1935, 1936, 1937, and 1939 specifically to prevent American involvement in foreign wars. The acts prohibited loans to belligerent nations, prohibited American ships from carrying arms to belligerents, prohibited Americans from traveling on belligerent ships. The 1939 Act modified earlier versions to allow belligerents to purchase American weapons on a cash-and-carry basis. They could buy weapons if they paid cash and transported the weapons on their own ships. No credit, no American transportation, no American involvement beyond the sale. Britain began placing massive orders for American weapons in September 1939. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, rifles, artillery. The orders were enormous and grew continuously. By June 1940, after the fall of France, Britain was ordering weapons at rates that would exhaust British gold reserves within months. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940. He immediately understood Britain's financial situation was unsustainable. British purchasing agents in America were spending approximately $50 million per week on weapons and supplies. At that rate, Britain's gold reserves would be exhausted by spring 1941. After that, British orders would stop. American weapons would stop flowing. The British military would run out of ammunition, aircraft, vehicles. Germany would win. Churchill tried everything to extend British purchasing power. Britain sold assets in America, British-owned companies, British investments in American corporations, anything that could be liquidated. The sales raised perhaps $2 billion. It delayed bankruptcy by several months, but did not solve the fundamental problem. Britain was spending far more than it could pay. In November 1940, Churchill sent Roosevelt a detailed letter explaining Britain's financial situation. The letter was brutally frank. Britain was approaching the point where it could no longer pay cash for American supplies. Churchill wrote that the moment was approaching when Britain would no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. If this happened, Britain would be unable to continue the war. Churchill was not begging. He was stating facts. Britain had approximately $2 billion in gold and liquid assets remaining. Commitments for weapons already ordered exceeded $5 billion. The mathematics were simple. Within months, Britain would be unable to pay for weapons. The Neutrality Acts prohibited loans. Therefore, the weapons shipments would stop unless America changed the law. Roosevelt understood the implications perfectly. If Britain fell, Germany would control Europe from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. German industry, French industry, Belgian industry, Dutch industry, Czech industry, all producing weapons for Germany. German forces would have unlimited access to European resources. The United States would face a hostile superpower controlling Europe's industrial capacity. But Roosevelt could not simply give weapons to Britain. The Neutrality Acts prohibited it. American public opinion was deeply isolationist. Millions of Americans believed European wars were not America's problem. They believed World War I had been a mistake. They were determined not to repeat it. Congress reflected this sentiment. Any proposal to give weapons to Britain would face enormous opposition. Roosevelt needed to thread an impossible needle. Change American law to allow unlimited aid to Britain. Do it without appearing to drag America into war. Do it despite isolationist opposition controlling significant congressional votes. Do it before Britain's gold reserves ran out. The solution was Lend-Lease. The concept was simple but revolutionary. America would lend or lease weapons to nations whose defense was vital to American security. The weapons would be returned after the war, or replaced, or paid for eventually under terms to be negotiated later. The key point was that payment was deferred indefinitely. Britain could receive weapons without paying cash immediately. The Neutrality Act's prohibition on loans was circumvented because this was not technically a loan. It was a lease, like leasing a car. The analogy was deliberately misleading. You lease a car and return it in working condition. Britain would use American weapons until they were destroyed, then request more. There would be no returning used tanks and aircraft. But the legal fiction allowed Roosevelt to present the policy as business arrangement, not a gift, and certainly not American involvement in the war. Roosevelt's team drafted the legislation in December 1940. The bill's number was chosen carefully, H.R. X, House Resolution 1776. The symbolism was intentional, the Declaration of Independence, American freedom, patriotism. The bill's opponents would be arguing against H.R. 1776, which sounded unpatriotic, even to discuss opposing. The bill's formal title was An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States. Note defense of the United States, not aid to Britain. The bill's text authorized the president to manufacture, sell, transfer, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of arms, ammunition, and supplies to any nation whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The language was sweeping. The president could give anything to anyone if he decided their defense was vital to American security. No congressional approval required for individual transactions. Congress would appropriate money, but the president would decide who received aid and how much. It was an enormous grant of executive power. Roosevelt introduced the bill in January 1941. The political battle began immediately. Isolationists were furious. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana called Lend-Lease the New Deal's AAA foreign policy. It will plow under every fourth American boy. The quote was inflammatory, designed to suggest Lend-Lease meant war and American casualties. Roosevelt was livid when he heard Wheeler's statement. At a press conference, Roosevelt called it the most untruthful, the most dastardly, unpatriotic thing that has ever been said. Quote me on that. The exchange revealed how bitter the debate had become. The isolationist coalition was powerful. The America First Committee, founded in September 1940, had 800,000 members by early 1941. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, was the committee's most prominent spokesman. Lindbergh gave speeches arguing that Britain would lose regardless of American aid, that American involvement would be futile, that the United States should negotiate with Germany to preserve American security while staying out of European wars. Lindbergh's position had ugly undertones. He had visited Germany in 1936 and 1938, been decorated by the Nazi government, expressed admiration for German aviation technology and German military power. His speeches sometimes included references to Jewish influence pushing America toward war. Roosevelt despised Lindbergh but could not simply dismiss him. Lindbergh was enormously popular. His speeches drew massive crowds. His opposition to Lend-Lease carried weight with millions of Americans. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee held hearings on H.R. 1776 starting January 15, 1941. The testimony extended for weeks. Supporters argued that aiding Britain was essential to American security. If Britain fell, America would face a world dominated by hostile dictatorships. Isolationists argued that Lend-Lease would drag America into war, that Britain's fight was not America's fight, that American resources should be used for American defense. Secretary of War Henry Stimson testified that Britain was America's first line of defense. If Britain fell, Germany would control the Atlantic. American trade would be strangled. America would face constant threat. Stimson argued that giving weapons to Britain was cheaper and safer than fighting Germany directly. Let the British do the fighting with American equipment. Isolationist senators attacked this logic. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota argued that Stimson's position was a trick to get America into the war. He said once America gave weapons to Britain, America would be committed to ensuring Britain's survival, which would inevitably mean American military involvement. Nye was not entirely wrong. Lend-Lease did create commitment to Britain's survival, which did make American entry into the war more likely. But Roosevelt could not admit this openly. The testimony that mattered most came from military officers. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, testified that America could afford to give weapons to Britain while maintaining adequate forces for American defense. Marshall presented detailed production figures showing American industry could produce enough weapons for both Britain and American rearmament. The testimony was critical because it neutralized isolationist arguments that aiding Britain would leave America defenseless. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, testified similarly about naval production. He stated that American shipyards could build enough destroyers and escort vessels to supply Britain while maintaining adequate American naval strength. The military testimony provided political cover for congressmen nervous about voting for Lend-Lease. If the military said America could afford it, voting yes was defensible. Public opinion was divided, but shifting. Polls in January 1941 showed approximately 54% of Americans supported aid to Britain even if it meant risk of war. That was narrow majority, but it was majority. Importantly, support was higher among educated Americans, urban Americans, Americans on the East Coast. Congressional districts in major cities tended to support Lend-Lease. Rural districts, particularly in the Midwest and Mountain West, were more isolationist. Roosevelt used every tool at his disposal. His radio addresses, the famous fireside chats, explained why aid to Britain served American interests. His December 29, 1940 fireside chat was titled "On the Arsenal of Democracy." Roosevelt argued that America's security depended on Britain's survival. If Britain fell, Germany would control the Atlantic, American commerce would be threatened, American security would be compromised. Therefore, America must become the arsenal of democracy, producing weapons for nations fighting dictatorship. The phrase, "arsenal of democracy," was brilliant marketing. It suggested American production, American jobs, American prosperity. It suggested America was helping democracy fight tyranny without American soldiers fighting. It made Lend-Lease sound patriotic and prudent simultaneously. The House of Representatives voted on Lend-Lease on February 8, 1941. The vote was 260 to 165 in favor, bipartisan but not overwhelming. 236 Democrats voted yes, 24 voted no, 24 Republicans voted yes, 135 voted no. The party split was clear. Democrats, led by Roosevelt, supported aid to Britain. Republicans, generally more isolationist, opposed it. But enough Republicans defected to pass the bill. The Senate debate was more contentious. Isolationist senators fought every clause. They proposed amendments to limit presidential power, to require specific congressional approval for aid to the USSR if the bill passed, to sunset the authorization after a fixed period. Most amendments were defeated. The Senate understood that weakening the bill meant delaying aid to Britain, which meant Britain might collapse before aid arrived. The Senate voted on March 8, 1941. The vote was 60-31 in favor. Again, bipartisan, but split along party lines. 49 Democrats voted yes, 13 voted no, 10 Republicans voted yes, 17 voted no. The regional split was evident. Southern and Eastern senators mostly voted yes. Midwestern and Mountain West senators mostly voted no. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act into law on March 11, 1941. He immediately requested a $7 billion appropriation to begin purchasing weapons and supplies for Britain. Congress appropriated the money within weeks. The aid began flowing. But Lend-Lease's passage did not solve Britain's immediate problem. The money would purchase weapons, but the weapons had to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters, and delivered to Britain. The process took months. Meanwhile, Britain's gold reserves were still depleting. The initial Lend-Lease appropriation in March 1941 authorized future aid. It did not cancel existing British orders that required cash payment. Britain was still spending its remaining gold reserves on weapons ordered before Lend-Lease passed. By April 1941, British gold reserves had fallen to approximately $400 million. Existing commitments totaled over $2 billion. Britain was weeks from bankruptcy. Roosevelt authorized an emergency measure. Existing British orders were transferred to Lend-Lease retroactively. Britain no longer had to pay cash for weapons already ordered. The orders would be fulfilled under Lend-Lease terms. This administrative decision saved Britain from immediate bankruptcy. Churchill later called it the moment when Britain's survival was assured. The logistics of delivering Lend-Lease aid were staggering. Ships had to cross the Atlantic carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, vehicles, food, raw materials. German U-boats hunted these convoys constantly. In 1941, U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships at rates approaching 300,000 tons monthly. Every ship sunk meant weapons lost. Every weapon lost meant British forces fighting with reduced supplies. The convoy system protected merchant ships but was never perfect. Convoys typically included 30 to 60 merchant ships escorted by destroyers and corvettes. The escorts could drive off or sink U-boats, but they could not provide perfect protection. Some convoys lost 10% to 20% of ships. The crews knew the risks. Merchant sailors on North Atlantic convoys in 1941 faced higher casualty rates than most combat units. Aircraft were shipped in crates, disassembled. Tanks were driven into cargo holds. Trucks were driven up ramps and secured. Ammunition was loaded in reinforced containers. Food was packed in crates. Every cubic foot of cargo space was utilized. A single Liberty ship could carry approximately 2,500 tons of ammunition, or 440 light trucks, or 230 million rifle rounds. The quantities were enormous and still insufficient for Britain's needs. The Soviet Union was not initially included in Lend-Lease. When Germany invaded the USSR on June 22, 1941, American public opinion toward the Soviets was hostile. The USSR had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939. Soviet forces had invaded Poland from the east, while Germany invaded from the west. The USSR had attacked Finland in the Winter War. Americans viewed the Soviets as nearly as bad as the Nazis. But Roosevelt understood that Soviet survival was strategically vital. If the USSR fell, Germany would control Soviet oil, Soviet wheat, Soviet resources. German military power would be effectively unlimited. Britain could not win against Germany controlling all of Europe, including Soviet territory. Therefore, Soviet survival was essential to British survival, which was essential to American security. Roosevelt began sending limited aid to the USSR in summer 1941. Initially, the aid was not under Lend-Lease. It was purchased through various arrangements, but the amounts were small. The USSR needed massive aid immediately. German forces were approaching Moscow. Soviet factories were being evacuated east. Soviet oil supplies were threatened. Without substantial American aid, Soviet resistance might collapse. In September 1941, Roosevelt authorized extending Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. The decision was politically controversial. Isolationists had opposed aiding Britain. They were even more opposed to aiding Stalin. Americans remembered Stalin's purges, the forced collectivization that killed millions, the totalitarian dictatorship. Sending weapons to Stalin seemed like supporting one evil dictator against another. Roosevelt argued that Soviet survival served American interests regardless of Soviet ideology. Germany was the immediate threat. The USSR was fighting Germany. Therefore, aiding the USSR weakened Germany, which served American security. The logic was coldly pragmatic. It ignored Soviet crimes because Soviet resistance to Germany was strategically useful. Congress was not asked to vote on extending Lend-Lease to the USSR. The original Lend-Lease Act authorized the president to aid any nation whose defense he deemed vital to American security. Roosevelt simply declared Soviet defense was vital. Congress could protest but could not block the decision without amending or repealing Lend-Lease entirely, which would cut aid to Britain as well. Aid to the USSR began in October 1941. Initially, the supplies were modest, but Roosevelt and Churchill committed to substantial aid at the Moscow Conference in late September 1941. British and American representatives met with Stalin and promised 400 tanks and 500 aircraft monthly. The promise seemed impossible to fulfill given production constraints and shipping difficulties, but Roosevelt insisted the aid would be delivered. The route to the Soviet Union was even more dangerous than the Atlantic convoys. Supplies went through three routes: the Arctic route to Murmansk, the Persian route through Iran, and the Pacific route to Vladivostok. Each had problems. The Arctic route was shortest but most dangerous. Convoys sailed from Britain around Norway to Murmansk, passing through waters patrolled by German U-boats, surface ships, and aircraft based in Norway. The route was operational only part of the year due to ice. Winter convoys faced storms, ice, and near-total darkness. Summer convoys faced 24-hour daylight that made hiding from German aircraft impossible. Losses on Arctic convoys sometimes exceeded 20%. Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 lost 24 of 36 ships. The crews who survived called it a slaughter. The Persian route was safer but slower. Supplies were shipped to Iran, unloaded at Persian Gulf ports, transported overboard by truck or rail through Iran to the Soviet border. The route required building roads and railways through Iranian mountains. American engineers spent months constructing the infrastructure. Once operational, the Persian route delivered approximately 30% of Lend-Lease aid to the USSR. It was slow but reliable. The Pacific route went to Vladivostok in the Soviet Far East. Soviet-flagged ships carried supplies from American West Coast ports. Germany and Japan were allies, but the USSR was not at war with Japan until August 1945. Japanese authorities allowed Soviet ships to pass. The supplies arrived in Vladivostok and were transported westward via the Trans-Siberian Railway. The route was safest, but involved transporting supplies 5,000 miles across the Soviet Union, tying up Soviet rail capacity. The quantities delivered were enormous. Total Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945 exceeded $11 billion at 1940s prices, approximately $180 billion in 2024 dollars. The aid included 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, 2.77 million tons of petroleum products, 48 million tons of ammunition and explosives, 15 million pairs of boots, railroad locomotives, railroad cars, telephone wire, radio equipment, industrial machinery, medical supplies. The trucks were particularly critical. Soviet industry produced tanks and aircraft but lacked truck production capacity. American-made Studebaker trucks became the standard Soviet transport vehicle. Soviet armies advancing into Germany in 1944 and 1945 moved on American trucks. Soviet artillery was towed by American trucks. Soviet supplies were carried in American trucks. The mobility of Soviet forces depended heavily on American vehicles. Food was equally critical. Soviet agricultural production collapsed during the war. German occupation of Ukraine eliminated the USSR's breadbasket. Soviet farmers were conscripted into the Red Army. Equipment was scarce. The USSR faced potential famine without food imports. American Spam, powdered eggs, canned meat kept Soviet civilians and soldiers fed. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov later acknowledged that without American food shipments, the USSR could not have continued fighting. British Lend-Lease aid was even larger. Total aid to Britain exceeded $31 billion, approximately $480 billion in 2024 dollars. The aid included 17.5 million tons of supplies delivered through 1945, aircraft, tanks, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, food, including meats, fats, cheese, eggs, canned goods, raw materials including steel, aluminum, copper, chemicals, machine tools and industrial equipment, oil and petroleum products. Britain received approximately 60% of all Lend-Lease aid. The USSR received approximately 22%. The remainder went to China, France, and other nations. The total Lend-Lease appropriation through 1945 was approximately $50 billion, roughly $780 billion in 2024 dollars. It was the largest aid program in history up to that point. The program's scale revealed American industrial capacity. The United States was simultaneously rearming its own military, supplying Britain, supplying the USSR, supplying multiple smaller nations, and maintaining civilian production. American factories produced enough weapons to equip American forces, plus equip Allied forces. The abundance was overwhelming. Soviet soldiers fought in American boots, drove American trucks, ate American food, communicated on American radios, and wore uniforms made partially from American cotton. British soldiers fired American-made ammunition, flew in American-made aircraft, and ate American-grown wheat. The Allied war effort ran on American production. Stalin acknowledged this privately in 1943. At the Tehran Conference, Stalin raised a toast to American production. He said the war would have been lost without American factories, American industrial capacity, American shipments, coming from Stalin, who rarely praised anyone. The acknowledgement was significant. Soviet propaganda publicly minimized Lend-Lease, claiming Soviet victory resulted entirely from Soviet efforts. But Soviet leaders knew differently. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, later admitted that Lend-Lease deliveries were crucial. He stated that without American trucks, Soviet forces could not have advanced. Without American locomotives, Soviet railways would have collapsed. Without American aluminum, Soviet aircraft production would have been impossible. The USSR would have survived German invasion, Khrushchev believed, but could not have advanced to Berlin without American aid. British acknowledgement was even more direct. Churchill told Parliament in 1944 that Lend-Lease had been vital to British survival. Without American aid, Britain would have faced starvation by 1942 and military collapse shortly after. Lend-Lease did not just help Britain, it saved Britain. But Lend-Lease had strategic consequences beyond simply providing weapons. It made American neutrality a fiction. Once American factories were producing weapons exclusively for Britain and the USSR, once American merchant ships were carrying those weapons through war zones, once American escort vessels were protecting convoys from German U-boats, America was involved in the war, regardless of formal declarations. German leaders understood this. Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. The declaration surprised some American officials who expected Germany to avoid war with America, but Hitler's logic was straightforward. America was already waging economic war against Germany through Lend-Lease. American shipments sustained Britain and the USSR. American factories produced weapons killing German soldiers. Formal declaration of war changed nothing except legal status. Lend-Lease effectively committed America to Allied victory before America entered the war. The $50 billion investment could only be justified if the Allies won. If Britain and the USSR fell, the investment was wasted. Therefore, America had financial incentive to ensure Allied victory. which meant eventual American military intervention was inevitable. Isolationists had feared this logic. They had argued that Lend-Lease would drag America into the war. They were correct, but Roosevelt's strategy worked politically because Pearl Harbor made the argument irrelevant. Japan's attack united American public opinion. Isolationism died December 7, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, Lend-Lease expanded dramatically. Production increased, shipments accelerated, congressional opposition disappeared. America was at war, and Lend-Lease was the foundation of Allied logistics. The program's financial terms were deliberately vague. Lend-Lease aid was technically a loan. Eventually, recipient nations would repay or return the weapons, but everyone understood this was fiction. How do you return a tank that was destroyed in combat? How do you repay food that was eaten? The expectation was that payment would be negotiated after the war, under terms favorable to borrowers. Final settlement came in 1972 for Britain and 1990 for the USSR. Britain repaid approximately $7.5 billion of the $31 billion received, roughly 24 cents on the dollar. The USSR repaid approximately $722 million, less than 7% of the $11 billion received. The settlements acknowledged that Lend-Lease had been essentially a gift disguised as a loan. American taxpayers paid for Allied victory through industrial production and financial generosity. Was it worth it? The counterfactual is stark. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would have collapsed in 1942. British gold reserves would have been exhausted. Weapons shipments would have stopped. German U-boats and aircraft would have strangled Britain. Churchill would have faced impossible choice: negotiate surrender or watch Britain starve while defenseless. Britain might have negotiated, giving Germany de facto control of Europe. Without Lend-Lease, the USSR might have survived German invasion but could not have advanced westward. Soviet forces would have lacked trucks, locomotives, food, ammunition to sustain offensives. Germany might have stabilized the Eastern Front. The war might have stalemated with Germany controlling most of Europe indefinitely. America would have faced a world where Germany dominated Europe, Japan dominated East Asia, and American trade was strangled by hostile powers controlling most industrial capacity outside the Western Hemisphere. American security would have required massive military spending indefinitely. The economic cost would have been far higher than $50 billion. Lend-Lease was strategically brilliant. For $50 billion, America ensured Germany's defeat without American soldiers fighting until American industry was fully mobilized. British and Soviet soldiers died fighting Germany while American factories produced the weapons. By the time American forces entered combat in strength in 1944, Germany was already being ground down. American casualties were far lower than they would have been if America had fought Germany alone, or fought Germany after Germany had defeated Britain and the USSR. The program demonstrated that industrial capacity determined modern war outcomes more than military tactics. Germany had better tactics in 1941 and 1942. German soldiers were better trained. German officers were more experienced. None of it mattered because Germany faced opponents with access to American production. The USSR could lose entire armies and rebuild them with American trucks and American radios. Britain could lose aircraft and replace them with American planes. Germany could not replace losses at equivalent rates. The war of attrition favored the Allies because American factories sustained Allied forces while German forces depleted. Lend-Lease also demonstrated American industrial capacity to potential enemies. Japan and Germany both knew America had large industrial base, but seeing American factories supply three major military powers simultaneously while also maintaining civilian economy showed capacity that seemed impossible. German and Japanese planners had consistently underestimated American production. Lend-Lease statistics showed they were not even close. America could produce more tanks, aircraft, trucks than Germany and Japan combined while barely straining American economy. The political fight to pass Lend-Lease revealed deep divisions in American society. Isolationists genuinely believed European wars were not America's problem. They believed American involvement would waste American lives for no benefit. They lost the argument, but their concerns were not irrational. World War I had killed 116,000 Americans and achieved little from isolationist perspective. European nations went back to fighting each other within 20 years. Why should America care? Roosevelt's answer was that geography no longer protected America. Aircraft could cross oceans. Submarines could threaten American shipping thousands of miles from American shores. If hostile powers controlled Europe and Asia, America would be isolated and vulnerable. American security required preventing any single power from dominating Eurasia. Therefore, aiding nations fighting Germany and Japan served American interests even if America remained technically neutral. The argument won politically, but more importantly, it won strategically. Lend-Lease armed Britain and the USSR while America remained at peace. When America entered the war, American allies were still fighting rather than conquered. The Allied coalition defeated Germany and Japan, with American production sustaining forces on multiple fronts. The $50 billion investment bought victory at cost far below what fighting alone would have required. The final irony was that Lend-Lease made American neutrality meaningless. Once American factories were devoted to producing weapons for Allied forces, once American merchant sailors were dying delivering those weapons, once American policy was committed to Allied victory, America was at war in everything but name. The legal fiction of neutrality collapsed under the weight of industrial reality. Roosevelt achieved what he wanted. American industrial power committed to defeating dictatorship before American soldiers were committed. The political genius was selling this policy as keeping America out of war, while actually ensuring America would eventually enter the war from position of strength with allies still resisting rather than conquered. Lend-Lease was not neutral. It was belligerent. It armed America's future allies while America prepared for inevitable war. The $50 billion bought Allied victory. It kept Britain fighting. It kept the USSR fighting. It ensured that when American forces entered combat, they fought alongside strong allies rather than alone against victorious enemies. The return on investment was incalculable. America emerged from World War II as global superpower because American industrial capacity had sustained Allied resistance when defeat seemed certain. Lend-Lease was not charity. It was strategic investment that paid dividends far exceeding the cost.